Today with me are Advisory Committee Chair Heather Doubledam and Vice Chair Elsa Lam, our Executive Committee Chair Stephanie Hussain, and Exec Talk Committee Sharon Phillips, as well as a number of beat volunteers that are helping out with the event. I would like to begin with taking a moment to acknowledge the land that we stand on. The land is based on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Guanda. And it is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit.
Thanks, Keemya. Hi, everybody. My name is Stephanie Hussain. I am the chair of BEAT's Executive Committee. Thanks to everybody for joining us tonight online and in person. We are honored to have Sue Jean Chung host tonight's Beat Talk. Thanks for joining us. We are a volunteer-run organization made up of architects, designers, leaders, and entrepreneurs, creating opportunities for community building, advocacy, networking, and mentorship. We believe that empowering women in the design profession improves and enriches the practice of architecture, the quality of the built environment, and ultimately the human experience. We are committed to creating lasting, systemic, and transformational change with purpose-driven action, openness, compassion, and respect for diverse perspectives. BEA currently includes chapters in Toronto, Northern Canada, Atlantic Canada, and the Prairies. Thanks for joining us. I'd like to ask Sharon, who is a key part of organizing tonight's event, to come up.
Thank you, Stephanie. A little bit about Beat Talks. Beat Talks are small private events hosted at local architecture firms which showcase their work and the people behind it. This talk qualifies for one OAA Structured Learning Hour, so please stay till the end to receive credit. Without further ado, I'd like to pass it on to Elsa to introduce Sue Jean and the firm.
We've actually divided this up into lots of little tranches. So I'll be introducing the JCI, and then Heather will be introducing Sue Jean. So Studio JCI was founded in 2007 by Sue Jean and Jayat. Their work ranges across single-family, multi-unit res, public, commercial, and healthcare projects. And they bridge between traditional architectural practice and the realm of real estate development. And they especially have extensive experience in feasibility studies. The firm supports and guides their clients through the regulatory and planning maze, and they have a real understanding of the market forces that affect the investment return of those firms. So all of those invisible factors that are crucial to the resulting built environment that we see in all cities, and especially in Toronto. And I've recently seen them at work a little bit on a rendering that popped up in my Facebook feeds about a new development at Pape and Danforth, which is close to where I live. So I can understand how you work in a way that kind of plays with fire.
That one got a little bit of buzz, yes.
Yeah. So I'm sure we'll hear more about that, if not in your presentation, then in the Q&A afterwards, perhaps.
Thank you.
So I'll pass it on to Heather.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming tonight. It's great to see so many faces here in person and everybody online. I have the privilege of introducing Sue Jean Chung herself. She's a founding principal of Studio JCI, as mentioned. She's a graduate of Daniels Faculty of Architecture at the University of Toronto and has taught there since graduating. Sue Jean believes that successful city building includes both contextually sensitive architectural design at a macro scale, as well as micro-level execution, that attention to detail that ensures the quality of the space is being built, as well as promoting well-being and renewed urban fabric. Just in terms of my own experience with their work, I was not that familiar with their work maybe a few years ago, and I was walking up Yonge Street around Summerhill and saw this absolutely beautiful building, incredibly well executed, and we're like, wow, this is amazing. Who did this? Took like a million snapshots, looked it up. Oh, Studio JCI. And then a year later, walking further up the street, found another one. So I'm a big fan of your work and the level of detail in terms of the execution, which we don't see as much as we hope to in these types of developments. Sue Jean is a respected and effective leader who guides new construction and really complex renovation projects at all scales and through every phase, and with her firm has contributed to over 2,000 residential units in the GTHA. She's very hands-on in the practice and with the firm's projects. She actively represents Studio JCI on construction sites and believes in more female presence in the construction industry. And through Sue Jean's leadership and business acumen, she has successfully grown Studio JCI from a team of 3 to over 35 architects and designers, which is very inspiring. I think it's also worth mentioning that in 2019, Studio JCI was awarded an Ontario Association of Architects Shift Challenge Award for their multi-touch project, which is this affordable housing model in urban centers, like the missing middle, like proposal for missing middle developments in neighborhoods across the city. So congratulations for that. Lastly, earlier this year, Sue Jean was inducted into the WLI Championship Team, which is an initiative by the Women's Leadership Institute of the Urban Lands Institute, annually honoring women's contribution, leadership, and skills in real estate development, land use, and city building. So welcome, Sue Jean. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much, Heather. Thank you to everybody for joining. Thank you, all the introductions. And thank you, everybody who's online as well. I thought I'd share just a little bit more about our office. Here at Studio JCI, we take pride in being a diverse and multicultural studio, creating an open and inclusive environment for all. In our studio of over 30 people, we've got representation from 11 different countries. I mean, this is an amazing group of talented designers and thinkers that come with either local or international training. Our mission at JCI is to improve the way people live, evolve the way architects add value, and to develop a future generation of problem solvers. A little bit more about myself. My parents were both born in Korea. They immigrated to Canada in the late 60s. So I was born here. I am a pure second-generation Korean Canadian. I graduated from the U of T with a Bachelor's of Architecture in 1999. I'm currently a member of the OAA, the RAIC, and the TSA. And as mentioned in the introduction, I'm a founding partner with my partner, Keemya Chung. We started the studio about a bit more than 16 years ago. And as Heather had mentioned, earlier this year, I had the honor of being selected as part of the WLI Championship Team, along with some other notable women in our industry, including Heather Doubledan, Sydney Brown, Jay Deshmukh, and Jennifer Mallard. I'll start by sharing a little story. It was the summer after my 3rd year of undergraduate studies. I was coming home from work and I was on the bus. And I happened to bump into a classmate of mine. Now, I remember this was particularly the Tuesday after a long weekend. So I asked, "How was your long weekend?" And he looks to me and he says, "Oh, I worked 40 hours over this past weekend working on a model. We presented it to the client, and it turns out the client likes the first option better." And internally I thought, see, that's the problem with architects. They're just too passionate about what they do. They're so consumed in their profession. I mean, let me tell you about this guy. This was the guy who was always talking about the latest architect or the latest project that was published in the magazine. This was the guy, he would actually sit in the front row of a crit session with all the other critics and engage in the dialogue, while the rest of us are sleep deprived from the all-nighter and just sitting at the back and watching our peers get scrutinized. This was the guy where some of us would be walking to grab a bite to eat, and he'd say, "Hey guys, look at that window detail, let's go take a closer look." And the rest of us are like, "Please, we just want to eat." So when he told me how he had spent 40 hours on one weekend working on a model that eventually got rejected, that became a definitive point in my life. See, I decided from that point on, I was going to add as number 3 on my list of what I look for in a husband, not an architect. I mean, I'd never see the guy. He'd be at work all the time. So life has a funny way of turning things around. Not only did I marry an architect, but I married that guy on the bus. The reason why I'm sharing this story is rather than talk about specific projects, I wanted to share my journey as an architect, some of the unexpected turnarounds in my journey, and some of the lessons that I've learned. I initially titled this talk, How to Develop Leadership and Garner Respect from Construction Managers, Trades, Building Inspectors, Consultants, and Clients. I mentioned it to a friend of mine, and she said to me, Sue Jean, that title is 12 words too long. So I renamed it Breaking the Bamboo Ceiling, Tales of an Asian Female Architect on Site. But really, if there's something I want to share with you, some insights that I've gleaned over my years, it's how to develop leadership and garner respect from construction managers, trades, building inspectors, consultants, and clients. Now, most of these stories actually come from my exposure and my experiences to site, but I'm going to be sharing with you things that hopefully will apply to any stage of your development and at any phase of project that you're working on. So here are 5 things I think you need to know in order to develop leadership and garner respect from a bunch of people. First and foremost, you need to know yourself. At the WLI Championship event earlier this year, we broke out into smaller groups. And a question was asked, what was your greatest fear going into your industry? My response, architects. Architects were my greatest fear going into this industry. I mean, you have to admit, architecture is a pretty romanticized profession. When I say the word architect, how many of you guys immediately think about the guy who prepared the permit drawings for a barrier-free ramp? Right? Or how many of you think about the firm that did the oncology unit at the hospital? No. When I heard the word architect, I immediately thought people that design beautiful buildings. I think about people who are literally stretching the building envelope of what can be designed and constructed. I think of thought leaders and placemakers and people that get involved in these macroscopic city-scale discussions. And see, my biggest issue going into this industry was that's not me. I'm an introvert by nature. I like to work in the background, and I really don't like standing out. I'm not aggressive in my personality, and I prefer to avoid conflict. I like going deep into the technical things, whether it's the nuances of the zoning bylaw, or whether it's interpretation and application of building code, or even how the technical details of a material ought to be installed. I like making things efficient. So coming out of school with my B.Arch, I thought that being an amazing designer is really what was needed to be considered an architect with a capital A. So much so, I actually wasn't planning on being an architect. I kind of decided in year 4, you know what? I'm going to finish my studies, but I'm not going to be an architect. Well, life has a way of turning things around. I ended up working at an architecture firm. And after years of being in this profession, one of the things I realized I really love about architecture is just how broadly based it is. I mean, yes, there are opportunities to design beautiful buildings and be part of thought leadership and all that, but there's the technical aspects of how a building gets built. There's things like implementation and workflow and process. There's human management, like people management, financial management, technology management. There's being able to see a building go up. And all of these things are part of this profession we call architecture. And eventually, I found my place as an architect. Meet Gord. The very first time I went to a site solo, Gord was the site super that met me there. I was a young architectural intern at that point. And as we were talking, he said, I've been doing construction for 22 years. And inwardly, I thought, man, 22 years? I was in elementary school 22 years ago. And I immediately felt like a minority in every respect. my gender, my age, my ethnicity. Fact of the matter is, at first, when I started going to sites, I felt like a minority all the time. I was young, I was Asian, I was female, and almost everybody that I worked with on site were older, male, and non-Asian. I was the one that was cognizant of being the odd one out. Now, I have to admit, no one actually diminished or disparaged me while I was on site, at least not that I was aware of. But I realized this was an internal issue that I was dealing with. You know, I remember a few years prior, in the firm I worked at previously, there was this petite Italian woman, and she was doing CA for one of the projects. And she seemed so sweet, you know, Sue Jean, how are you? How was your weekend? Until she got on the phone with a contractor. And then she became so foul-mouthed, I felt bad for the contractor she was talking to. I mean, I'd see her tiny little frame hunched over her desk, her phone in her hand, and saying, "Don't you effing give me that BS, there's no way I'm accepting that change." The rest of the open office is quiet, and you can feel the chills in the room. That was one of my earlier exposures to women on site and in CA. And again, I struggled with the issue. That's not me. You know, for what it's worth, actually everyone that I've worked with on site has been quite amenable and willing to work together. The more I worked on site, the more I realized my preconceived stereotypes that you needed to be aggressive and brash in order to be successful on site diminished. Of course, there's going to be difficult personalities. There's always difficult personalities. But you don't need to go to site to experience that. They're all around us. You know, another thing I realized about myself is how I deal with conflict. I remember talking to a guy, and he was like, you know, for guys, we can just have at it. We can swear at each other all day, and whether we're in the game or on the site, and once we clock out or once the game is done, we can go out and have a beer. Now, I know that's a gross generalization of men, so I'm not trying to say that, but what I realized is when I get into an argument on site, that's not how I deal with it. When I get into an argument, I stew. Driving home from the site, I'm simmering in frustration. You know, by the time it's dinner and I've had a chance to really think about what happened, I'm roiling in my emotions. Later that night, I'm lying in bed and I'm just thinking again and again of what happened, and I'm thinking of all the unfiltered things I want to say to the guy. The next day, I'm still agitated. And so that's something I realized about myself, that I had to make a conscious decision not to allow things to get too personal. I had to be willing to have a thicker skin, to not be emotional and to keep it professional. The last thing I want to say about knowing yourself is also being aware of what it is you represent as an architect. As an architect, we do have professional obligations. It's not just about designing pretty buildings, but there's matters of life safety, building code, fire separations. There's contract law. There are other regulations and standards out there, and sometimes our job is not to be bullish about it, but just to identify a standard and reinforce it. You know, these standards supersede anybody's personality. So when a client or a contractor or whatever is saying, you know, I've got this issue, it's not about who is more bullish, who's more aggressive, and who is more brash. There's standards that supersede personality. When I go to sites, when I deal with clients, when I communicate with consultants, it's all from a foundation level of being aware of my personality, my strengths and weaknesses, my competencies, and my professional obligations. So the first step in developing leadership and garnering respect is to know yourself. Respect yourself and be self-aware. Number 2, know your drawings. By the time you get to site, you need to have a very good handle on what is on your drawings, what each sheet has, and where to find the information. If you're just starting off in your architectural career, you might feel like there's a boatload of information that you don't know. But at the very least, you can start by knowing what it is that you draw. You know, where are the plans located? Where's the RCPs? Where are the sections cut? Can you readily flip through your drawings and find information when you're on site? Because you cannot be discovering your drawing set in front of a construction manager or a trade. You'll lose all credibility. You know, trades more often than not will say something is not included in their scope. It wasn't in the drawings. And if you don't know your drawing set well enough, then you won't have any defense against it. There have been so many times someone has said to me, that's not in the scope. And I'm like, really? I flip over to like this page or that note and I say, look, it says right here in this elevation or right here in this note, X. So it is in your scope and this is what I expect to be done. Take some time also to read through the notes. You know, the little fine print on your title block or maybe in the front end of your drawings, where it's all words and no drawings. Take some time to read through it because those still form part of the contract documents. And sometimes those little notes, as much as they can seem small and insignificant, can be your greatest defense when talking and dealing with trades. I would say know your specs as well, because in the end, this is the document that supersedes your drawings. And there's a whole lot more information in your specs than what your drawings would contain. I know the specs can be daunting. You can have over 385 pages of all written description. One of the things I suggest to people you know, when they're starting out in CA is rather than trying to absorb all 385 pages at once, if you have a chance to look at a submittal, just read through the specs section for that submittal, whether it's waterproofing, gypsum board. It's a lot easier to digest 12 pages as opposed to 385. It's also important to know and understand what it is you're drawing. I mean, when you think about it, drawings are actually just abstract representations of 3D elements. Wood doesn't look like that. Stairs don't look like that. They're just lines. And it's so easy to just draw and not actually understand what it is you're drawing. You can know how to draw a plan, format an RCP, fill out a section, or do the markups that you're given. But do you really understand what that translates to in real life? You know, this ceiling at the soffit for the upper level was drawn at 10 feet. Annotating 3,050 millimeters on an RCP is easy. But do you really understand and comprehend what that's going to feel like in person? You know, what is that experience when you're up at the top and it's compressed and then as you start walking down, it opens up? Once you draw something and then you see it translated into reality, then it feeds back into your understanding of what it is you draw and it makes you a better designer. You know, knowing your drawings is the first step. And I'd like to suggest as much as possible, as much as you have opportunity, go visit the site of whatever it is that you draw. Because that's when you really feel what you've drawn. You can't understand light, the quality of the materiality, reflectivity of sheen. You can't understand that in a 2D drawing. If you don't have the opportunity to go to site, then I'd suggest just look around you. If there's a place that feels right to you, take a moment to pause and figure out what is it? Is it the proportion of the space? Is it the lighting? Is it the materiality? So know your drawings. Know the content. Know it like the back of your hand, that you can just flip through a drawing set and say, this is this, that's where I find that. Because when you do that, then you can speak with authority to whatever construction managers or trades, and you can clarify and defend the scope of work. But then also know your drawings. Understand what it is that you're drawing. Because in the end, these abstract representations of lines, hatches, words, and numbers, you need to understand what they translate into real life. And when you understand what it is you're drawing, then you can speak with greater clarity and vision when you're explaining to the end user what to expect. Number 3, know the process. You know, instead of being just part of a production team, try to get involved and understand the process of what it is, what the approvals are that you need to be going through. Understand what the process actually entails. See, everything we draw, whether it's a feasibility study or whether it's tender documents, there's a specific reason for the information that needs to be presented. And there's a specific thing that the end user needs in order to move it down the process. You know, back in 2016, I remember going to a site, and I was going to be meeting the building inspector and the site super. And this was my first time meeting them. Again, both the site super and the building inspector were older, male, non-Asian. And here was this young Asian architect. I mean, back then, I really actually wished I had more gray hair, just so that I looked a little bit older. When the building inspector arrived, he had this know-it-all attitude, and he totally treated me like a kid. He started explaining, you know, there's special permissions you need to get. It's called SPA. And because there's a TTC track, you may need special approvals from the TTC. And he just went on and just telling me how I needed to do my job. Once he was done, I proceeded to tell him, Mr. Inspector, we submitted for SPA back in 2015. We recently received our NOAC. In order to even get to our NOAC, we had to receive our TTC technical review. I personally spent 6 months talking with Mark so-and-so from the TTC to make sure we had all those approvals in place. The actual site plan agreement is currently with city legals. It should take maybe another 6 or 7 months for that to be executed. And at that point, then the client will sign it and we'll be getting our full building permit. Speaking of the building permit, we've already submitted the full package: architectural, structural, mechanical, electrical. The reason why we're here today is because we actually have a demolition permit for the works involved in this site. This is a conditional demolition permit, and that's why we're here to meet you. We don't even have the mechanisms to call you to the site if we didn't have a permit. Then I went to the drawings, I leaned over and I started flipping through, explaining this is the scope of work, this is where we're removing things, this is where the hoarding is going to be, this is where the status of the consultant reviews, and just explained the whole process. You know, after the building inspector left, the site super turned to me and said, wow, you know your stuff. See, if I wasn't aware of the process, if I didn't know the history of everything that went down, then I couldn't have responded with the authority or the clarity that the circumstances required. You know, as the project progressed, we had the opportunity not just to do the shell, but also to do multiple tenant-related works. In the end, this particular project had 6 partial occupancy permits, a final building permit, and 3 interior fit-outs that I was responsible for. In the end, I represented 4 different clients and 9 different closeout permits. I ended up seeing this building inspector a lot during this time. And by the end of the project, the building inspector preferred to work with me because he knew that I knew my stuff. He would talk to me over the construction manager because I knew who to talk to first. He got confused between all the different permits and the clients. And he knew that I could figure out what documents were required to close out. I'll admit, this was the first time I went through a partial occupancy permit. And I learned a lot through this. Going through a process for the first time, there is a steep learning curve. But once you've had a chance to go through it a couple of times, then you learn. Now I can speak with authority to any future client or construction manager when they ask about partial occupancy versus full. And I can give them all the things to expect, the number of inspections, the paperwork that you need to have, all because I know the process and I was familiar with it. So knowing the process. Number 4, know what other people do. You know, already as architects, there's a lot of stuff we need to know just about architecture alone. But the more you understand what other people do, whether it's your clients, consultants, construction managers, the more you're in a position to demonstrate leadership. And the more people will respect you because they understand they know that you understand the big picture and you're not just looking at the project through a single disciplinary lens. You know, oftentimes we think of architecture like this. It's the expression of our concept in built form. which is true. And yes, as architects, we have the opportunity and the privilege to be designing buildings that hopefully bring improvement to the area. However, in the grand scheme of everything involved to turn an idea into reality, our role as an architect is more like this. What we produce is a small segment in the grand scheme of everything that's required to be built. The reality is there is a myriad of different consultants, stakeholders, and entities involved in designing and constructing a building. And I'll admit, looking at that can be daunting and overwhelming. But the more you understand what other people do, the more you're able to show leadership as the architect that can orchestrate it all into a cohesive project. Because in the end, that is one of the things we do as architects. We synthesize all these other disciplines into a final built form that we call architecture. And if we don't know what the other stakeholders do, then that leads to a haphazard process of people staying in their own lanes, focusing on their own things, and then in the end, the final built form ends up being a mishmash of uncoordinated mistake after uncoordinated mistake. It's also important to recognize the differences between all these people. For instance, the motivations of a client who wants to physically build his own multi-generational house is different from the motivations of a condo developer. And while a condo developer, while a condo built form may look similar, the things that drive their decisions are different from that of someone who's building purpose-built rentals. Large buildings carry with them complexities and lots of other trades that need to be coordinated. And understanding how these are sequenced are an important part of what we design. And yet there also exists complexities in the details and how materials actually come together that need to be well thought out. You know, most people will say they want a good-looking building. I haven't had a client say, Sue Jean, I just want something mediocre. Everybody wants something nice. But you need to be aware that there are other constraints out there that drive decisions and other constraints that come into play. And these need to be taken into consideration in order for all the stakeholders to consider a project a success. You can have a beautiful building, but if it's $15 million over budget, if the roof is leaking, if the HVAC system underperforms, then there will be very few people that consider the project successful. So the more you understand what other people do, what they need, the more you can provide solutions that address those needs. And the more you provide viable solutions and meaningful solutions, then the more you'll garner respect from them. And the last thing, go deep. You know, I'd mentioned there's already a broad base of knowledge that we need to know as architects, but don't be afraid to go deep to really understand it. If something doesn't make sense, ask. Keep asking until you're satisfied. There was a time I was working on a project. It was a multi-unit residential, and I had a client consultant coordination meeting. And this was, we were talking about wet walls. So we had this condition where we had a demising wall between suites, and then you've got these wet walls, which is where all the plumbing risers go. And we had this back-to-back washroom scenario where there was a bathroom, a wet wall, a demising wall, and a wet wall. So in the end, we had an assembly that was 20 inches thick. When I mentioned it to the client, he said, that's too much real estate. You know, what can we do to fix it? So I drew up a little sketch. I sent it to the mechanical engineer, and I asked, is there any reason why we can't put these plumbing risers in the demising wall? And his response was, no, it's fine. I believe it's a fire stopping issue. I'm like, oh, fair enough. But I knew enough about the code that you can put penetrations through a rated wall. So I went back to the office, I flipped through, and sure enough, I didn't see anything. So I asked my code consultant, is there any reason why you can't put a plumbing riser within a demising wall? And his response, from a code perspective, no problem. I believe it's an acoustic issue. Oh, okay. But then I started thinking, like conceptually, the sound of running water vertically, whether it's in a demising wall or a wet wall, you're still going to hear it. So then I asked my acoustic consultant, same sketch, is there any reason why you can't put a plumbing riser in a demising wall? And you know what he said? Acoustically, that's fine. I believe it's a mechanical issue. See, that whole conversation went full circle. Everyone just assumed because of someone else's discipline, you couldn't do it. So we designed the project with plumbing risers in the demising wall. And I could pretty confidently say, moving forward, if I had to do another project, I would design plumbing risers in a wet wall. Now, at least I know it because of the reasons. It's not just because someone told me so, but I investigated, I looked at all the different aspects. And so next time a client tells me that's too much space, can we put it in a demising wall? I at least have the context, the perspective, and the information that I can give to the client so that they can make an educated decision. So don't be afraid to go deep in your learning. If something doesn't make sense, investigate it, understand it. Then you'll be in a position to speak in authority on that subject. You can provide the rationale and the justification on why something needs to be done a certain way. You know, when I look back at my early days of architecture and going into architecture, I didn't have the confidence that I had what it took to be an architect. And I didn't have a clear understanding of what this profession actually entailed. What I did have was a look I don't think I'm going to go back to anytime soon. But just like looking back at old pictures and remembering when we're young and naive, we grow, we adapt, and we learn. I'm not going to lie, doing CA is tough. It requires discipline, it requires perseverance. And I've had the privilege of starting off doing small, single-family wood frame homes to mid-rise, complex steel renovations, going all the way up to concrete towers. And I've learned through my time doing CA that there is always a solution to a problem. Look, things are always going to hit the fan. There will always be an emergency at the 11th hour. And having to deal with these have personally honed my ability to be a problem solver. And that ability to solve problems, the functionality of being able to step back, look at an issue from all the different angles, and then hone in on a solution, this ability isn't something that just stays with you on site. It's an ability that stays with you wherever you go. Getting to know myself, my drawings, understanding the process and what other people do, and going deep by expanding my knowledge base, this was all a process for me. These are the things that help me develop leadership and garner respect from various people. These are the things that helped forge who I am as an architect. And these are the tales of an Asian female architect on site. I know that if someone like me can find her place as an architect, then so can you. Thank you.
So I have a question that came out of talking about knowing what you know, who you are and what you know, but also I guess the flip side of that is like talking about knowing what you don't know. And I think you addressed that a little bit in talking about how going deep and educating yourself and gaining more knowledge that you can be confident about so that you can get respect that way. But I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about like, what do you do when you don't know something in the moment, and especially when you're in some kind of tense site situation where you might feel like threatened, or you might feel like somebody's like you should know something. I guess how do you what do you do in that moment, both within yourself and I guess what do you say to somebody when you're faced with that kind of situation?
No, that's a great question. Thank you, Elsa. There was a lot I didn't know going into construction. It's actually embarrassing what I didn't know. So some of the things I've noticed, and I've actually worked with other consultants as well, and oftentimes I had gone to a site where someone would, there would be another consultant there, and people would ask a question, and they're like, oh, I don't know, or let me go ask my boss. and let me go ask my boss, and let me go ask my boss. And you know, after you start hearing that, like by the third time, people have figured out you don't know what you're doing. And then you lose respect. And that respect is really difficult to gain back. You know, what I like to do, or what I did, and what I, you know, how I train our staff is just say, you know what, there's something I need to check back at the office, let me get back to you. Because really in the end, like, these projects are big and they're complex. So if you don't have a solution right away, at least say, let me just go back to the office and check, and I'll get back to you. At least that just sounds like, you know what, you're like 80% you know, but there's just 20%, versus, I don't know, let me check the other person. I was actually in a meeting one time, and a guy kept saying, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know, that finally the client actually said to him, why are you here? But that's basically what happens. If you're always, I don't know, people start questioning. I'll admit, earlier on, there was a lot of I fake it till I make it. But at least, you know, if you present yourself as, you know, let me just get back to you, then it doesn't diminish the credibility as quickly as if you say, I don't know.
A question too, but I also want to add to that it's a little daunting when you start out on the construction site and you don't know, say 90% of the things, and you can't always say, I'm going to check and get back to you. Usually you're with somebody who's more senior than you if you're junior or intermediate, but one of my rules in the office is that we don't make decisions on the site. Yes. Ever about anything, and we tell the contractor that this is complex, there's a lot of different disciplines involved, so we're going to go back, we're going to take all your questions, we're going to figure things out, and we're going to get back to you in writing.
The question was about the role of architecture and, you know, designing and the romanticizing of the profession, and where that fits in with some of the more mundane types of architectural projects. As an architect, yes, we should be romantic, right? We should hope for the best. We should strive for better. We shouldn't settle for mediocrity. Having said that, not every building is intended to be amazing. McDonald's are McDonald's, right? Drive-throughs are drive-throughs. So there's only so much I think you can consider on that front. There's so many other stakeholders involved. You know, like when you mentioned McDonald's, there's corporate stakeholders. They've got a particular brand and they want to do things a certain way. Personally, for me, what I found is a personal value for me is the service we provide as architects. Because whether it's a drive-through or whether it's a beautiful building, there's still as a professional obligation that we have for things like life safety and building code. There's still ways we can add value to the client. You know, one of my earlier projects was doing a Tim Hortons drive-through for a client. And then that grew into doing a value village. And then that grew into a 3-story infill on Parliament. And then that grew to doing the project at Summerhill and Yonge. And then that grew to doing the project at Rosedale and Yonge. And then that grew to doing the project on College. And now I've got 3 projects with this client on Eglinton in a 1-block radius. So you can't underestimate the services that we could also provide. Because as I mentioned, everyone has different motivations. For some people, really their motivation is I need to make money, right? For other people, they want to make an impact and change. You know, so it's understanding what the client is and then providing a service. But I do hope we all stay romantic as architects, right? That we always strive to create something beautiful, you know, and
There's a good question here. There's a question from somebody who's online that they feel that their question was answered, but I think that there's more that could be added to this question. Was the progression from single-family homes to larger multi-unit residential or large commercial projects a natural evolution, or did you actively seek it out? And at what point, years along, did you start to make that shift? And I guess, just to add to that, how did that happen? And was it just about the projects you were doing, or were you chasing the work? Were you networking? Like, how active were you at making that shift?
Thank you. So I'm an introvert. I was even telling Heather earlier today, yeah, I saw you at the WLI and I wanted to say hi, but I was too shy. I'm a work in progress when it comes to networking. Fortunately for us, we didn't have to chase the work. It came down to the quality of service. And that's why one of our key missions is evolve the way architects add value. When I say that, I'm not saying just designing beautiful buildings, but who is it that we're servicing? And if I'm servicing a client, as I mentioned, like, relationships are key, right? The CEO of this asset management company that I'm now doing these multiple projects for, he started off as a drywaller. He was a trade on one of our earlier projects doing drywall. And somehow my husband maintained connection with him, and he ended up starting this asset management company, but they were small. And so they were doing small commercial projects like Tim Hortons and Value Villages, and then they've grown and grown and grown and grown. So we've had an opportunity to grow with them, but it's because we were able to provide services that address their needs. Once the Rosedale and the Summerhill projects took off, then as you mentioned, like, a lot of people actually noticed those projects, and that gave us sort of another tier. It's definitely been an interesting process for us, scaling from wood frame single family to doing concrete high rises. And I wish I had like a 1, 2, 3 formula for it. I don't. I think the other thing I'm going to just kind of put out there is, I have to be honest, I have to give credit to my husband, because not only has he been my greatest, what's the word? No. He's been. Not only has he been my greatest critic, but he has been my greatest supporter. And he's given me those opportunities. I can't stand here saying, JCI grew only because of me. It's a team effort, and he's got certain personalities that are different from mine. And so, in the end, it really was a team effort. And I think that really helped attribute in the growth. The question was there anything that I wish I would have known when transitioning from being like just an employee in a profession to a business owner? The answer is lots, right? Like everything. When we started, I laugh because I was the finance department and my husband was the IT department. I've never taken a single bookkeeping or economics course in my life. So suddenly I had to learn, like back then it was HST and GST and PST, right? I had to learn how to do invoicing. I had to, learn how to do IT management. We had to figure out human resources and how to grow. Cash flow management, right? There is a lot. I think now there are a lot more modules available from the OAA, and there's like small groups that you can meet with. But it definitely is a transition. And what I've realized is, really to start your own, you have to be more than just an architect. You have to transition into a business person. And you're a business person that's selling architecture. And that was a fundamental shift. Because it's not just about the work that I do, it's about how to actually operate a business. As a female architect on site, do I find I have to prove myself? Yes, all the time. But for what it's worth, when I talk to the other guys that go to site, it's the same. So everybody wants to take the easy route out, so they'll just dump it on somebody else, right? There have been times where, for instance, a construction manager would ask me to do something. And this is part of knowing yourself but knowing what other people do, is if you don't know what their roles are, then it's very easy for them to push it onto you. and say, well, this is your job. I had one construction, she was like sort of the project administrator, asked me to join a meeting to talk about the tenders of different hardware suppliers. And I thought, actually, that's not my job. That's your job. You're the construction manager. I'm the architect. You're supposed to vet the tenders, and then if you have questions, then you RFI it and you send it back. So that's really important. If I didn't know what they're supposed to do, then it's very easy for them to just keep pushing it. Everyone will just pile it onto you, right? I've had trades say, can you provide these additional drawings? And I'm like, that's your scope of work, right? So am I pushing back all the time? And that's probably one of the most tiring things about being on site, is that you're constantly pushing back. I really applaud people who go through a whole site, because I think by the time you're at 80%, you're like so tired that you just want to give up. You're like, there's a propensity to, at the 80% mark, you know what, that's fine. You know what, that's fine. You know what, just leave it, that's fine, right? I'm not going to fight anymore because you're tired. But, I really want to encourage people, when you are on site, try to keep that drive. Bring another person with you at 80% and let them do all the fighting or something, right? Like switch it up, because there is, perseverance required. Single family homes, they are maybe like 12 months, 18 months. Some of these larger projects, like we're on year 4.5, right? And, that's when it does get tiring. People have already turned around, like different people have come and gone. And so yeah, that would be my suggestion. But am I fighting? Yes, all the time.
So you've spoken a lot about process and your own experience. I have a question about projects and sustainability. So in the industry that you're dealing with in terms of condominium projects, there's a lot of concrete. Is there any interest and push towards mass timber, like using timber for these projects? Have you had the opportunity to work on any? Are you sort of ever kind of pushing on the sustainability side?
I would absolutely love to work on a mass timber project. Part of the knowing what other people do is understanding what drives them. And unfortunately, there's a lot of developers out there. They have a bottom line, and it's profits. So, there's limitations to what we can do. There's a certain material palette, there's a certain cost per square foot that we have to adhere to. I do hope that more developers will be forward thinking about that. I know sustainability and the carbon tax, those are big things that are coming down the pipeline, or they're already here, but it's gonna really hit the developers sort of in this next season. So I really do hope, unfortunately, I think there really needs to be policy change to really change behaviors of developers, especially when it comes to profits. Or there needs to be an industry change that makes doing things like mass timber viable and profitable. So it's a much bigger question, or there's a much bigger, the solution to that problem is much bigger than just a single project.